There are now over 8 billion people on Earth, but how many humans have lived throughout our species' history? How many Homo sapiens have walked the surface of our planet in total? Researchers have already seriously asked themselves this strange question, and the conclusion they reached is absolutely unsettling. Before sharing the result, let me take a moment to imagine all of us alive today. And for that, I'm going to need you, or rather, the full power of your imagination. Picture this small cube as 1 million people. Now, here are 10 million. This larger square shows 100 million. If you represented 100 million people here, then over here, it's 1 billion. And here before you are the 8 billion people who are alive today. This is the humanity of the present. Now, we'll compare ourselves with all who lived before us, with past humanity. I'll let you count if you want. Here, 108,000 small squares represent the 108 billion humans who likely lived before us. And before we go find out how demographers and historians managed to come up with this number, and above all, the incredible moments in history during which these people lived, let's return to our cubes, our doors, each small square holding 1 million people. When we look at this number of 116 billion Homo sapiens who have walked the surface of our planet in total, vertigo can strike you in two ways. The first is to realize that that's a lot of dead people for every human being currently alive and breathing air. There are nearly 14 times more people who have passed away. The second way to feel dizzy is to realize that there are actually a huge number of us alive right now. Because if we remember that humanity has existed for at least 200,000 years, the fact that nearly 7% of anatomically modern humans who have ever been born throughout the entire history of humanity are currently alive is, in itself, an absolutely phenomenal percentage. I have to say it again, partly for you, but also a lot for myself. Roughly 7% of all Homo sapiens who have ever lived are alive today. You're one of them. And 1 in 7 people ever born lived in the past 2 centuries. Okay, and there's something else, maybe even stranger. These are the times in history when those 116 billion people lived. And to help you grasp this strangeness, I need to tell you a bit about how historians and demographers go about estimating this number. First, they look at all the traces left at one time or another, in all the records that have come down to us. States or empires that, among other things, love to count the number of people living under their rule, priests, soldiers, and ordinary citizens alike, in order to collect taxes. Except all this only gives them a partial view. Only a small fraction of records have survived, and many individuals went unnoticed by administrations. And above all, inevitably, as we go further and further back in time, even royal lineages eventually get lost in the mists of oblivion and the names disappear. Since, in the end, we eventually go beyond the point at which writing was invented. So, for 99% of the history of all humanity, we have absolutely no demographic data. There was no census in prehistoric times. We examine the size of the remains we have and, most importantly, study our distant ancestors' fossils in detail, which allow us to estimate how many children they had on average and how long they lived. And once we have the birth rates and life expectancies of individuals according to the periods, there's one thing left to do: agree on when our story begins. That's not obvious since there's no clear break or exact moment when humanity began. The transition to our species, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, was gradual. Demographers in the study I referenced began counting 200,000 years ago to estimate the 108 billion humans who lived before us. And if you follow the news a bit, you may have heard that we recently discovered remains of Homo sapiens that push our origins back to 300,000 years ago. And here, you might think that a difference of 100,000 years at the starting point is still a lot. What's fascinating is how strange that is. Moving humanity's origin back 100,000 years barely affects the overall scale, because for a very long time Homo sapiens populations were extremely small, and the human species numbered at most only a few 100,000 individuals across the entire globe. In other words, there were not many more inhabitants in the world back then than there are in New Caledonia today. It is believed there were fewer than 100,000, possibly under 50,000. Barely 8 billion humans have lived on Earth since the appearance of the first humans. That's absolutely crazy. As many people lived during the first 150,000 years of humanity as there are currently alive. About 100,000 years ago, by the most optimistic estimates, there were probably barely more Homo sapiens on the entire Earth than there are currently on Reunion Island. And Neanderthals, at the same time, numbered around 200,000 for all of Europe. About 50,000 years ago, the global population is estimated to have been under 2 million. So it is lower than that of Paris proper today. Around 10,000 years ago, about 5 million people lived worldwide. That's about as many as there are currently in Portugal. In Europe, at the same time, there were about as many inhabitants on the entire continent as there are in Guadeloupe today. And then, with the development of agriculture, the world population will increase significantly. In the space of 2,000 years, the population of the entire Near East exceeds 5 million inhabitants. From 4,000 before Christ to 2,000 before Christ, Europe's population grew from around 2 million to 20 million. Much of northern India and eastern China do the same. And in 2000 before Christ, the population of the entire globe reaches 100 million inhabitants. Back then, Earth's population matched Egypt's today. When Christianity emerged 2,000 years later, the world had just under 300 million people. That's about as many as there are in Indonesia today. And now we need to pause to look at how far we've come. Of the roughly 116 billion humans who have ever existed, it's believed that about half of all humanity was born before the first century of our era, while the other half lived during the last 2 millennia. In short, about as many people will be born in the next 2,000 years as in the previous 200,000 years. World population will then grow slowly, characterized by violent upheavals from various disasters such as wars or plagues. And it wasn't until the middle of the 17th century that it surpassed 500 million. A century and a half later, around 1800, the population topped 1 billion. I don't need to spell it out for you. Anyway, from that point on, it gradually turns exponential. Due to scientific and industrial revolutions, better living conditions, and medical advances. The second billion was reached around 1920, the third in 1960, the fourth in 1975. In short, it accelerated, but after a few decades, it appears to have settled down. Most countries have even completed their demographic transition faster than expected. Today, the United Nations projects a peak population of about 10 to 11 billion by century's end. These numbers are staggering and hard to grasp, but they're available on the Our World in Data website. To help visualize all this, they came up with an hourglass. A giant hourglass that will allow us to put into perspective not the passage of time, but the passage of people on Earth. Here's how this hourglass works. Each grain of sand here represents 10 million people. There are 800 in the top of the hourglass. For the 8 billion people alive whom I hope will fall as late as possible. And in the lower part, 10,800 grains represent the 108 billion people who have lived and died. The grains you freeze mid-fall are those who enter or leave our world each year. You have represented the 140 million newborns born each year. Add 14 grains to the hourglass, and there you have the 60 million people who, each year, in the form of 6 grains, leave us, and they will be added to those who are no longer here. What is particularly interesting about this representation is that it allows us to roughly place events or historical figures in the layers of grains that have piled up. Mandela must be somewhere around here, Newton over here, Socrates is probably at the level of this layer, and Nefertiti at that one. Somewhere around here are all the first humans who cultivated the earth. And all those who lived before the invention of agriculture are within this thickness here. And half of all these grains have fallen over the last 2 millennia. There's something else remarkable when we consider the 108 billion Homo sapiens who've lived on Earth. Because nearly half of the bottom of the hourglass is made up of children. Today, in nearly every country, life expectancy is over 60, but this is a very recent development. In the 18th century, global life expectancy was just 25 years, but that didn't mean everyone died young. Life expectancy averages are low mainly because many children died very young. In fact, it's believed that throughout almost all of human history, infant mortality rates could be as high as 500 deaths per 1,000 newborns, and life expectancy at birth was probably only about 10 years on average. We owe much to the 108 billion people who came before us. First of all, because among them are all of our direct ancestors, whose life stories quite literally made it possible for us to be alive today. but also because they helped shape much of the world as it is today. They laid the first stones of the civilizations from which ours descends. They created the languages we now speak and built many surrounding monuments, and developed so much know-how and knowledge from which we benefit today. They built and shaped a huge part of our culture. We are their heirs, just as humanity that is not yet born will in turn inherit what has been left to them. And after spending so much time looking in the rearview mirror, now we're going to look up at the top of the hourglass and take a closer look at what's ahead of us. And you'll see that if looking into the past is already dizzying, trying to grasp the scale of the future might be even more so. I'm not discussing our posterity. That would be like speaking to worms. Because, spoiler alert, in the short term, we're all going to die as individuals. But the big question we can ask ourselves is this: how long can this hourglass keep filling up and flowing? And with how many grains will we end up at the very end? The end of humanity, the moment when the last grain falls. To answer these seemingly crazy questions, we must estimate how many people will be born in the future. And that we absolutely do not know. However, there is one thing we can be certain of: eternity is far away. And our solar system will exist for billions more years and the universe for much longer. So let's play a little game, just like those of the past. The size of the future human population depends on how many children our descendants will have and on their life expectancy. And most importantly, how long humanity will last before extinction. Imagine we survive as a species for 1,000,000 years. The typical lifespan of a mammal species. Since 200,000 years have passed since our appearance, we still have 800,000 years left. To make things simpler, let's assume that the total world population stabilizes at around 10 billion people with a life expectancy of, let's say, about a century. That makes for round numbers and it's easier. With such a scenario, you end up with a future rich in 80 trillion people living over the next 800,000 years. Imagine one of our small squares again, but now it stands for 1 billion people. That's us, all the humans who are currently alive. That's the total of those who have died. And that, those who will one day live, the 80 trillion people yet to come. If that's the kind of scenario that awaits us, then we, the first 116 billion Homo sapiens, are also part of the first 0.15% of humanity. Okay, this is pretty mind-blowing. We might be living at the very beginning of human history. This is very speculative. If world population stabilizes at 15 billion future births, we'll be 50% higher. If it stabilizes at just 1 billion, then over the same period of time, we'll end up with 2 billion times fewer descendants. Do you get the idea? Anyway, the point of thinking about those who could potentially be born over the hundreds of thousands of years to come is mainly that, to allow us to understand the consequences of our actions. Because we are not just any species of mammal. We may be the first in Earth's history with the power to destroy ourselves. And for this potential humanity of the future to come about, the humanity of today must not shoot itself in the foot. These great powers we have are also an opportunity, to the extent that our intelligence could allow us to face the great catastrophes that will arise in the future. For example, dinosaurs couldn't survive an asteroid's impact. Whereas, on the other hand, if we were faced with it, and even without the help of Bruce Willis, we can assume that we would have a much better chance of making it than they did. Let's stay positive and face the future with optimism and ambition, assuming that we manage to overcome all the existential threats that could potentially fall on our heads in the more or less distant future. Nothing prevents us, then, from imagining that humanity could survive until our planet becomes uninhabitable over very long periods of time, due to the gradual increase in the sun's power. The moment when any form of complex life on the surface of our planet will become impossible is generally placed around 800 million years in the future. To illustrate how many humans might exist in the future, assuming our species survives, let's return to the allegory of grains of sand. If you see each person as a tiny grain, then consider all humanity, both past and present. You can build a tiny piece of beach, barely 10 square meters. By adding all those who could potentially walk on the surface of our planet until it becomes uninhabitable, you end up with a beach about 10 meters wide and 1,000 kilometers long. That's for the case where we vanish in 800 million years. However, humans could last longer, until one grain remains. We've lost sight of the idea. It's beyond the horizon. And what these tens of thousands of billions of potential lives tell us is that our responsibility is immense. A catastrophe that would end the history of humanity would not only destroy the present, but also the vast future of possibilities. In other words, preventing potential catastrophes that threaten our existence means not only saving human lives today, but also those of people who will one day live in the future. Count those who lived before and those yet to come. Above all, it's a reason to seriously reflect on our present, while forcing us to have a long-term vision and to ask ourselves about our legacy, about the marks we want to leave behind. Because even if it's hard to imagine the future, we can care about it, try to be good ancestors. Ancestors who, while thinking about solving the problems of their time, felt connected to the effects they would have on the world of tomorrow. One day, far in the future, our descendants may look back to stack and count little squares. And they will look with affection at those 0.15%, those who were present at the very beginning of humanity's history. The future remains a blank page. As the remaining 7% of the Homo genus, it's up to us to shape its present.